Hello to all researchers watching this video. If you are currently in this segment, then I would assume that you already have a research idea or a research topic in mind and are probably rearing to start writing your conceptual framework. But before we go to the actual writing of the conceptual framework, let's try to take a look at how you can refine your research idea. And you can do that by coming up with what we call as your research question, led of course by your research objectives. So when we talk about your research idea, this is still at the most abstract, right? This is what you envision to write about. But a better way to make sure that your idea eventually sees the light of day is to try and answer research questions about it. So when we pose a research question, we understand that research questions may be descriptive, such as, for example, asking the what, the when, the where, the who, the how. For example, what do customers think about product X? And a research question may also be evaluative and or explanatory, such as, for example, asking the why. Why do customers like or dislike product X? Remember that while we may start with a descriptive question, there should always be as much as possible an evaluative component. After all, when we write a research paper, we put forward our research thesis or that which we intend to prove or disprove. So while a descriptive question may be a good start, there should always be an evaluative component to it. For example, if you wanted to ask how much did the marketing campaign for the new range of products cost, that's a descriptive question, answering simply the question how much. And you could readily answer this one. Say, for example, they spent 1 million, and then after that, what next, right? Or then you may proceed to asking a more evaluative question, such as how effective was the marketing campaign for the new range of products? Or even to asking to what extent was the marketing campaign effective and why? So you get to see that we started with a descriptive question, but then eventually made it into or proceeded with an evaluative component, okay, to ensure that your research will really be able to contribute to the pool of knowledge. So here are some examples or illustrations as to how you can perhaps convert a research idea to a research question. For example, if the research idea is about advertising and share prices, you may convert this to a research question by asking, how does the running of a TV advertisement campaign designed to boost the company's image affect its share price? So you get to see the research question here is more evaluative. It does not simply ask how much does it cost, but it asks how did it affect the share price. And so therefore, this will eventually look at the maybe investment that went into advertising versus the share price changes. Or if you wanted to look at job recruitment via the internet as an example, a research question might be how effective is recruiting new staff via the internet in comparison with traditional methods? And this is where some of you would come in and say, we're going to do a comparative analysis, right? Or if you want to look at the use of aromas as a marketing device, perhaps your research question would sound something like, in what ways does the use of specific aromas in supermarkets affect buyer behavior? Or as a final example, if you wanted to study is the use of internet banking, perhaps you could ask the research question, what effect has the growth of internet banking had upon the uses customers make of branch facilities and why? So, in order for your research idea to transform into something that we envision to be useful to the pool of knowledge, there has got to be an evaluative component. Okay, now let's talk about your research objectives. So objectives must always be set after having formulated a good research question. Okay, these objectives are intended to explain the way in which you are going to answer the question. So we have first come up with the research questions, and then we will come up with research objectives. You will be able to spot or identify a research objective because they are normally headed by infinitive verbs, whereas research questions are questions. Research objectives are headed by infinitive verbs. They are in the statement form, such as, for example, to identify, to establish, to describe, to determine, to estimate, to develop, to compare, to analyze, to collect. Okay, so from our research questions, we will come up with our research objectives. For example, to compare the unemployment rate among all European countries, or to analyze the unemployment rate evolution from 2006 to 2016, or maybe to identify the factors associated with high unemployment rates, or to develop an explanatory theory that associates unemployment rate with other indicators such as, for example, gross domestic product. So we have effectively converted the questions to research objectives. Let's give another example. If your research question is, how effective are internet and intranet channels as a means to communicate with employees in company X? That's the research question, how effective. Your research objectives might be to, number one, first, identify each intranet and internet channel of employee communication used in the company. Then, to describe the company's objectives for each channel. Because remember, to determine effectiveness, we first have to know what it is intended for. Okay, so we know that something is effective if it meets the objectives. So, part of the research objective is to identify the company's objectives for each channel, that is, internet and intranet. Then, to identify and explore specific examples of how each channel has been beneficial or influential. Then, to identify and explore specific examples of where each channel has not been beneficial or influential. To determine a measure of effectiveness for each channel that shows whether and how the channel had met, exceeded, or failed to meet the objectives set for it. To compare measures of effectiveness across channels related to different organizational objectives, and to make recommendations about each channel's future use and fitness for purpose. So you would notice that the objectives are intended to help you answer your research question. So it's kind of like saying, how would you answer your research question? And then these are our objectives. Notice, however, that objectives may be there. You may have multiple objectives to a single research question, but since we are writing a publishable paper, and like what we have pointed out previously, journal space is not unlimited, we have to be able to choose only the most crucial and the most important concepts to be part of our paper. Then it is not necessary for you to enumerate or outline all of your objectives. It is enough that you state in your research paper, particularly in your introduction section, the main research objectives. The other research objectives, the sub-objectives, may be explored further in the paper. However, what is necessary is for you to understand when the members of the panel would ask you, what is your research objective? Then you answer your main research objective. All right, so these are two most common questions that are asked in proposal hearings and oral defense sessions. What is your research objective, or what is your research question? So make sure that you are ready to answer those two. In fact, right about now, you should already be thinking with your research topic, yeah, what is my research objective and what is our research question, right? So that would be a good exercise for you to help fine-tune your research topic. Now, as a bonus, let's talk about the research title. I have been receiving so many questions about the research title. Can it still be changed, etc., etc.? So as a rule of thumb, the research title should simply and concisely summarize the research question. It should reflect the concepts or variables in your research. Now, one thing that you have to avoid are unnecessary phrases such as a study to explore. I have seen a lot of titles along that line. Now, if your research question changes, then to answer your question, it will naturally lead to a change in your title. And that is why whenever you have introduced, whenever you have tweaked, whenever you have changed your research question, then it is a given that your research title should also change. So here are examples of research titles that you may use for inspiration, like reasons for mismatch between corporate strategy and the external environment, or the effectiveness of internet and intranet channels for employee communication, or the effect of healthy eating publicity on snack foods purchasing decisions. Notice how concise these titles are. The fewer the words, the better, so that the readers would readily appreciate what you are trying to do in your research. All right, so this might be a good time for you to maybe work on or reflect on what you are currently having as your research idea. Maybe from your main research idea, you could develop a research question. To the research question, you could develop at least 3 research objectives and then maybe develop a research title. This might be a good way for you to somehow firm up your existing research idea and hopefully come up with a stronger introduction as well. Now, if you are one of my students watching this video, then as my way of checking if you were able to somehow get the concepts that we have discussed, I'd like you to make a comment in the comment section of this video. Tell me at least one research question that you have for your research idea, and then at least one research objective. Okay, so let's just not have one research question, three research objectives, maybe just one research question and then three research objectives. Now, in order for us to come up with a critical review, or in order for us to come up with a more refined idea, then it is important that you did a good critical review of literature. Now, based on the previous critiques that we have made on some of the introductions submitted by some of the teams, I think one common weakness we have seen is a lack of a critical review of literature. So, just as a reminder, I know that this is the part that really entails a lot of work, and this is perhaps the part where you feel really tired, but just hang in there because the review of literature is essential for us to draw the gap. Okay, so why do we need to review the literature? We have mentioned this before, but just to let you appreciate it even more now, the literature review demonstrates an awareness of the current state of knowledge in your subject and its limitations. We recall that writing a research paper means we're joining a conversation, and this conversation is a conversation of scholars. We need to do a critical literature review in order to demonstrate that we are aware of what is the current state. Knowing what is the current state will help lead us better to the gap in knowledge. Now, a literature review as well would discuss what has been published and what is relevant to your research topic. And it shows that you understand your field and its key theories, concepts, and ideas, as well as the major issues and debates about your topic. Now, like what we have said, it is very important and actually quite a good news for you if the current state of the literature is in a current level, or is in a level of, like, say, disagreement over the acceptability of a certain theory, for example. So if there are debates around your topic, this might be a good source of a gap. Or maybe there are debates about the right methods to use, in order to investigate this particular phenomenon. That could lead you to your gap. And you would only know that if you have done a critical review of the literature. So essentially, this is the literature review process. We first had our research idea. We refined it by coming up with our research questions and objectives. We define the parameters. We conduct the literature search. We obtain the literature. We evaluate, and I think this is the part that is mostly lacking for most introductions that we have critiqued previously. We evaluate, we record, we generate and refine search items. We start drafting the review. Notice what happens. We may then find a need to redefine the parameters, and then the cycle starts all over. So that means that when you perform your literature review, it's not just like a discrete phase. You expect to define and redefine certain parameters, certain concepts, and may even lead you to redefine some of your original research questions and objectives. And that should not scare you, because that's essentially how the process of research works. We have this initial idea, we join the conversation of scholars, and perhaps some of the things we initially thought were okay have already been studied or are not sound arguments. And so we redefine, okay, and then we revise. So that's how the literature review process works. And like I said, don't be scared about that. It's just part of the research journey. Okay, now please remember that when we talk about the critical review of literature, it is not a simple summary of the books and journal articles that you have read. That's why sometimes it's quite frustrating when you read an introduction that contains the RRL, that it seems like the researchers are simply enumerating the stuff that they have read about. So it is not a simple summary of the books and articles that you have read. It is, however, a constructive analysis. And this is what your panelists would look for, the analysis of the literature. Now, this constructive analysis is intended to develop a clear argument about what the existing literature has said and what has not yet been said about your research question. This is where we draw out the gap. So this is the most important part of your introduction in a publishable paper. Okay, so it should be clear to whoever reads your paper that a gap is there. That's why for some teams, I'd normally tell them, okay, are you sure that you know what your gap is? And then usually they are able to tell me the gap. And then I would just tell them, okay, can you work back from there? Okay, can you make sure that everything you write before you tell us what the gap is would support or lead to the gap? Because that is what a critical review of literature should do. There are a lot of literature sources. You can have primary sources, secondary sources, and tertiary sources. These are arranged according to the increasing level of detail and the increasing time to publish. But like what we have mentioned previously, make sure that your sources are credible. Okay. Now, when you make your literature review, another perhaps what some tips that you could use in order to come up with a more critical literature review. So you will normally start by previewing, right? So previewing, we scan, we go through the abstract, and then find if this is something that might be relevant to our study. Then we annotate. Okay, we annotate, we take down notes, and perhaps in the traditional setup, we highlight things that we find to be important and relevant. After that, we summarize. And when we summarize, this is like I really appreciate how the word sum is represented here. Like, it should be shorter than the text. Use your own words, main ideas only, and do not forget to cite, and cite. Okay, to avoid plagiarism. And then you compare and contrast. Now, for most, I have noticed that it only stops with annotating, and sometimes even a little bit of summarizing. But what is usually missing is the comparing and the contrasting. And that is what differentiates a simple reading and summarizing to a critical review of literature. Remember, only two things matter. Evaluate, I repeat, evaluate what you have read and relate what you read to the other information. By doing those things, okay, by focusing on those two things, you can hopefully come up with a more critical literature review. Now, here are also some illustrations of how you can convert your descriptive writing to a more critical analytical writing, because sometimes I also notice that it's a problem with how you write it. So here are some tips on how, or illustrations on how you can convert descriptive writing to critical analytical writing. For example, under descriptive writing, it simply states what happened, but under critical analytical writing, it identifies the significance. In descriptive writing, you simply state what something is like, but in critical analytical writing, you evaluate the strengths and weaknesses. Descriptive writing simply gives the story, but critical writing weighs one piece of information against another. A descriptive writing simply states the order in which things happen, but under critical writing, you make reasoned judgments. Okay, descriptive writing simply says how to do something, but in critical writing, it argues a case according to the evidence. And this is where usually we get to see how one author argues against the use, for example, of one variable or one method, okay, because in relation to the phenomenon being studied. In descriptive writing, it explains what the theory says, but in critical writing, it shows why something is relevant, why something is suitable. Descriptive writing simply explains how something works, but critical writing indicates why something will work best. So you get to see the critical writing illustration, or the description of critical writing here really requires you to go beyond simply what you have read, but also to contribute what you think, right? So notes the methods used for descriptive writing, but under critical writing, it identifies whether something is appropriate or suitable, and may even, compare one versus the other and draw out reasons why one is more suitable than the other. Descriptive writing says when something occurred, but critical analytical writing identifies why the timing is of importance. Especially when you talk, for example, about a time series analysis, when you talk about um, like events in the timeline that are considered as disruptors or maybe outliers. Descriptive writing states the different components, but critical writing weighs up the importance of the components. Descriptive writing states the links between the items, but critical writing shows the relevance of the links. Descriptive writing gives information, but critical writing draws conclusions. So I hope at this point you get to look back to your literature review and assess for yourselves if you have been using more of descriptive writing in order to elevate that, perhaps use a more critical analytical writing approach, so that we could then see that you have really reviewed critically the literature. Here are some additional tips, okay, when you do your literature review. So you can use analytical tips. You can use the following review questions, these 5 critical questions which you got from Wallace and Ray. So for example, why am I reading this? Okay. Second, what is the authority trying to do in writing this? So maybe what is the scholar, what is the academician trying to do when they are writing it? Okay, so this may assist you in how valuable the writing may be for your purposes, because they might be writing about the same topic, but it may not be relevant to what you are trying to say. What is the writer saying? This is what I'm trying to say. What is your writer saying that is relevant to what I want to find out? How convincing is what the author is saying? In particular, is this argument based on a conclusion which is justified by the evidence? That's why you have to critically review the article, because you need to be able to see that the conclusion of the researcher is justified by the evidence that they have gathered and analyzed. And what use can I make of the reading? So, these are the 5 critical questions that you can use whenever you review a literature that will hopefully make you come up with a more a more strengthened version of your existing literature review. How would you know if you have found enough? I'm sorry, but I have no definite answer except to say it's up to you. Because you're the one who's trying to draw out the gap. You're the one trying to answer or come up with a research question and to establish that there is a need for your paper. So actually, it is up to you. We have developed some rules of thumb. Let's say, for example, there are 5 researchers to a team, maybe a minimum of 5 per researcher should make it to your RRL, but then these are really just rules of thumb. Okay, so whether you have reached or whether you have read an enough number of literature, it's really up to you. How up to date should the references be? I've also received some questions about this one. Now, we hear again some guidelines, such as, for example, 5 to 10 years back. Okay, in order to prove that the theory is still alive, recency is important, and I totally agree. But also, I would like to tell you that there are scholarly works that are quite dated but are still very much relevant. Okay, scholarly works such as, for example, those we consider to be seminal works or original works, and you would like to state them in your paper, and that's perfectly fine. For as long as your literature review also includes the more recent publications. Now, these recent publications will help prove that the theory you're trying to study is still alive. It has not yet been converted or proven to be a law. It's still a theory. It's still debatable. It's still something we can study about. Okay, so while you may cite some seminal original work, but then ideally your literature review should also contain recent publications, recent articles. Maybe as another rule of thumb, you can have 5 to 10 years back. Okay, just to show us that the theory you're trying to study is still alive. Okay, so here are the references we used for this input, okay, on how you refine your research idea. Hopefully, this will help you come up with a better written introduction. Just remember that you should be able to answer the questions, what is the gap? And your literature review should clearly show that gap. Another favorite question during the proposal hearing would be, what is your research objective and what is your research question? So hopefully you'll be able to answer those questions satisfactorily when you submit yourselves for the proposal hearing. So for now, I'd like to end this module right here. Thank you so much, everyone, for joining me, and I hope to see you in our next input.